My name is Korra. I'm the Avatar.
And I think you're going to be a great Avatar.
I am so proud of you, Avatar Korra.
I should be able to fix this. I'm the Avatar. Well, I'm the old Avatar, and my era's not over yet!
I didn't ask to be the Avatar, but I am, and I'm fulfilling my duties.
You are the Avatar.
I'm not the Avatar anymore.
Korra's story is one of survival. It's one of being beaten down and getting up over and over and over again. It's about mental health, PTSD and trauma and isolation and what it means to feel out of place in your own body. It's about how we define ourselves, our identity, and what happens when that's torn from us. Who do we become? All of this comes together in a complex psychology we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be talking about some pretty heavy stuff, so warnings on screen. If you don't feel you can engage with that, then I encourage you to step out.
I'm the Avatar! You gotta deal with it!
Right from the start, Korra's whole identity is being the Avatar. She masters fire, water, and earth from a very young age, and she's surrounded by people reinforcing and rewarding her for that identity, for embracing this role. People like the White Lotus. This role deeply affects not only how she values and understands herself, but how she believes others value and understand her. Her abilities, her strength, her independence, her specialness, her sense of justice, her destiny. Her sense of worth is intimately wrapped up in all of that. Every child goes through a process of identity formation. This is trying on different roles in life, different ways of imagining themselves, forming beliefs and values, finding strengths and ways to cope with weaknesses, and gradually they develop an answer to the question, who am I? This can be split into your personal identity, which is made up of your goals, your values and beliefs, your relational identity, which is essentially how you define yourself in relationships and in interactions with others, like I am a father, or I am a friend, or I am your protector. Then there's your collective identity, which is how you index yourself within certain social groups and categories, like waterbender, air nomad, or even just bender. Then there's your public identity, which is how you monitor yourself and present yourself in public. With all of these, from a very young age, Korra's identity is overwhelmingly defined by not only being a bender, but being the Avatar, being the most powerful person in the room. Her values, goals, and beliefs are pretty much all filtered through that lens. Her relational identity is similarly one-dimensional, especially as others relate to her, respect her, and listen to her purely as the Avatar. She's raised to position herself as the ultimate authority, the most powerful bender in the room, to prepare for one special particular role. A leadership figure, a political player, a person of cosmic importance on the world and spiritual stage. While her collective identity includes her being part of the Southern Water Tribe, that too defines her by being a Southern Waterbender, one of the few left since they were virtually wiped out by the Fire Nation. She carries that legacy too. But this is where her problems began. These ideas dominate who she is, who she believes she can be, but these aren't things that she necessarily developed for herself. These are things she was born into, formed from the expectations others have of her and what she should be, expectations which she deeply integrates into her sense of self and her measure of worth. While yes, Korra thrived in being the Avatar, she leapt at it from the earliest moment and opportunity. She basically skipped that identity formation process and went straight to, quote, identity maintenance, wherein people preserve a desired identity in the face of change or challenges as they emerge into the world, rather than exploring the possibility of a new sense of self. Where for an adult, this is a healthy psychological tendency, knowing who we are. In children, this can be the result of a kind of identity foreclosure, which is where someone prematurely commits to one identity, a set of values or goals, often determined by something outside of themselves. This often shows up in religious communities, which often pick your role and what you should be going into life, and the Avatar is, if nothing else, a religious role that every person who is born into it is expected to one day fulfill. Religiously justified identities and roles in the home and society can be deeply fulfilling, and I think Korra does find it genuinely fulfilling from a very young age. But they are also often overly rigid, imposed on children who have not yet fully developed or had the time to question them, and they create standards which may take years to leave behind and difficult relationships with our sense of self-worth outside of them. The system itself is ontologically important, and so fitting into it becomes ontologically necessary, a good thing. And imagining yourself outside of that system becomes the same as questioning the validity of the system itself. It becomes hard to separate what we think we want and need from what we're told we want and need, even when they often overlap, as they clearly do with Korra. And it's an identity which is highly dependent on external validation, on how others perceive her, on how she fits into the idea of how they think she should be, on her successes, on failures, on how much she measures up to the standard set by destiny. Even Korra competing in that pro-bending arena arises from her need for validation as the most powerful bender. As if by winning she affirms her value as the most powerful person in the room, as a bender. It's a microcosm of how she values herself. Being the Avatar means you don't get to be a person in the same way others do. From the youngest age possible, she took on the maximum responsibility for the world and measured herself against it. This is filling the boots of someone else and convincing yourself they belong to you. Which is why Korra's psychological journey is all about that one question. What happens when your identity is shattered? When you can't fulfill the role you thought you had, that you were born for, that every part of you is meant to fit into? When everything you defined yourself by is taken from you, as Korra breaks under the weight of a destiny she thought she chose.
But I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing half the time. It seems like I should be wiser.
The psychological deconstruction begins in small ways before it escalates. Korra finds herself pitted against Amon, an anti-bending revolutionary, but more importantly, someone who could take her bending away. Someone who poses a threat to her core identity in a way she has never had to face before in her life. She was prepared to lose a fight when arriving in Republic City, that's just part of being on the front lines. But not lose the thing which made herself useful in her mind, which made her valuable to others, to the world, which gave her purpose and the ability to effect change. It is the source of self-esteem and self-concept for her, but it's a self-concept which can now be taken from her. Driven by that fear and by that pride and by this desire to immediately step up, Korra challenges him onto a duel, doing exactly what she was raised to believe the Avatar should. Aang faced Ozai directly and he won. Kyoshi faced Chin the Conqueror and won. Roku didn't directly confront Sozin, and that led to the 100-Year War. If she doesn't act now, then she's going to be suffering that same fate. The failure to act is the ultimate failure of an Avatar in her mind. But then, she loses. Amon not only overpowers her, but worse, he lets her walk away with her bending. For the first time, Korra feels truly vulnerable, only keeping this core part of her identity because Mon allowed her to, with not even the threat of her in the future being enough to deter this man. And if that's the case, then how strong is she really when people like this look at her and they shrug? This identity she developed gave her a sense of high self-efficacy. This is the idea that she is very capable at effecting change in her own life. But the first time she really tries to do something, she finds herself incapable. But this is just an extension of Korra's broader struggles. She arrives in Republic City and finds it a place which thinks very little of the Avatar as an important role, going against everything she thought that she was trained and led to believe about who she was and the place she was meant to occupy. The police arrest her for trying to solve problems in the wrong way, and then politicians do not even view her as someone who is entitled to authority to help make decisions about the world.
Korra, you shouldn't be here. This is a closed meeting.
And worse, the equalist movement is not something which can be solved through decisive shows of power. If anything, they make it worse and give the equalists even more support. Korra feels it's her responsibility to solve these issues, but is woefully ill-equipped, especially because during a conflict between benders and non-benders, she's kind of the ultimate bender, the ultimate foe here. Korra struggles with morally complicated situations, like when Tarlok proposes increasingly authoritarian measures to control this anti-bending revolution, rounding people up and violent house-raiding tactics. At first, Korra supports him, this show of law and order and decisive action, but it soon becomes clear that this is not the way either. She finds herself in a no-win situation where she feels increasingly powerless and incapable.
Please help us. You're our avatar too.
Many gifted kids and prodigies grow up under really high expectations, which they internalize into their sense of self from very early on. When their performance doesn't match the ideal of who they should be and how well they should perform, especially later in life, or if the world doesn't provide an easy place for them to thrive based on those skills, this can lead to role strain and role confusion, tension between our capacity to meet expectations and the reality, especially if we don't feel that there is room for us in the role we thought we were intended for. In that, these people can become overly self-critical, obsessive, even self-destructive. The problem isn't the identity that they've pinned themselves to, they say. The problem has to be them. Because if it is the identity, then who else are they? What have they spent their life training to be? Are their successes really their own if they don't even matter? Korra is nothing else if not the quintessential gifted kid prodigy who thinks they're destined for a certain role in the world. She excelled at bending from a young age. She didn't struggle with taking up the mantle of responsibility like Aang did. She is built for this role. Built by herself and by everyone else, and she has the drive and moral fortitude to stand up for the little guy. But that identity is deeply dependent on context and how others view her, a social environment that allows her to fulfill it. To give you an example, parent is a role that people often mold themselves for. So when children move out of home, parents often enter a period of role confusion, having to redefine themselves without the people and the context to think of them as a parent. Korra has been raised with this idea of what it means to be the Avatar, but that doesn't really fit into the reality of Republic City or even the conflicts that she's facing. Her bending can't solve political unrest, her authority and values can't solve complex social issues which go back generations. She prepared herself for a world like the one Aang entered, with a clear good and evil and an obstacle needing defeat. That was easier, that was simpler, that was the world she heard so much about. This role strain often leads to these kids burning out. They lose themselves, their sense of worth, their self-efficacy before slowly returning to that identity formation phase, which they should have gone through when they were a lot younger, rediscovering who they can be outside of their giftedness, their specialness, and finding more sustainable sources of identity and self-esteem. Korra does undergo that transformation, that journey, but at first she is deep in maintaining that identity against all odds, against all the pressures of this world, often with less than healthy coping mechanisms. Maladaptive perfectionism is when any mistake becomes a massive failure and their self-worth becomes even more tied to these impossible standards. There's this desire to be perfect in these particular domains which they define themselves by, and it creates this cycle of self-doubt that prevents them from setting realistic goals for themselves, because realistic goals would be the same thing as letting go of a part of that identity they carry for themselves. The goals of their personal identity, their relational identity, and the duties they have to everyone around them, how everyone should understand them and view them publicly. If all of that doesn't go perfectly, then they've fallen short. So, instead, they tighten control on themselves in those specific areas. They raise standards on themselves in those specific areas. In this, perfectionism is domain-specific. In other words, Korra is perfectionist when it comes to excelling at every area of what she thinks the Avatar should be and means, power, fighting, leadership, standing up, but lacks when it comes to spirituality or romance, let's say. And it becomes pretty clear that she develops many of those same tendencies, that intense fear of failure, of not being enough, of her chronic self-criticism. She can beat almost anyone in a duel. She's mastered 3 elements from a young age, so when airbending doesn't come to her immediately, this is a hit to her ego. Her pursuit of perfection in this very narrow, role-dependent identity leads to overexertion, recklessness. Just as she challenges Amon to a duel, she later tries the same thing with Tarlok. That need for perfection, that need to win, need to control, need to prove herself on her own risks destabilizing her identity as the Avatar. because anything less than being the brave, competent, independent avatar whose power dwarfs everyone else is a failing in her role. I'm not sure Korra is exactly a perfectionist, but you can see those psychological tendencies creeping in at the edges. One way to understand all of this is through Korra's locus of control. This is a psychological term for how much we believe the outcomes of our life is the result of our own actions versus sort of controlled by other things beyond us. It can be internal, which means that we believe that they're a result of what we do in our actions, or they can be external, controlled by forces beyond ourselves. While believing our actions has an impact on our lives and the world around us is generally a healthy thing, Korra has an overly rigid internal focus. She believes everything is or should be within her control, because that's what the Avatar is for. That's what she is for. It gives her that high self-efficacy and a belief in her own skills, but these obstacles and repeated failures crystallize all of that into guilt, into self-blame and impulsivity, recklessness, and psychological instability over time as she puts more and more things down to the results of her actions and her failures. Slowly, she begins to lose that high self-efficacy, and there is nothing worse than believing everything is the result of your actions, everything is your responsibility, but not believing yourself capable of rising to that. This struggle really emerges in the later seasons, but we do see the hints, the ghosts, the beginnings of all of that here. She needs to learn which things are the result of her actions and which are beyond her control. She needs to develop a healthy relationship with all of that. This is about her developing an accurate understanding of herself, her role, and her abilities just as much as the world around her. All of this comes to a head when Amon takes Korra's bending from her. Identity is also built around things called self-schemas. These are deep, fundamental assumptions about ourselves, like I'm a skilled artist, or in Korra's case, I'm a skilled bender. Ego integrity involves having a narrative about ourselves, which encompasses all of our successes, our failures, our flaws, and our strengths into a healthy equilibrium, a story that we can understand ourselves and our lives through. Self-schema feed into that. They underpin this narrative and give us a framework through which we can live at ease with ourselves, be healthy, that we can just function normally. But here, Amon basically undoes the most critical self-schema Korra has about herself, that she is a powerful bender, that she is a competent avatar, that the world needs her. All of this leads to a collapse in Korra's ego integrity.
I told you I would destroy you.
This often precipitates depression, despair, and other more destructive things, and we see that play out in Korra. We see it hinted at. What is the point of her now? To the extent that she even believes that Mako would refuse or even want to be her friend now because she's not the Avatar.
I mean, go away. Back to Republic City. Get on with your life.
What are you talking about?
I'm not the Avatar anymore. You don't need to do me any favors.
She flees into the wilderness, to the edge of a cliff. There's this one shot of her tears falling into the depths, and you could read this as her contemplating taking her own life. People take their own lives for a lot of complicated reasons, but a recurring theme is the loss of role in life, the collapse of ego integrity, of those self-schemas underpinning them. This is why it's connected to job loss or to the loss of loved ones. It's not just despair, but psychologically, it's the loss of a context in which we imagine ourselves. It's the loss of the ability to say, I am a competent accountant. It's the loss of the ability to say, I am a good father. Rebuilding identity from that fundamental level is hard, incredibly hard. And sometimes we aren't able to. Korra gets her powers back from Aang, and psychologically speaking, because of how quickly this happens, I think she basically resists the opportunity to really reconsider who she is outside of her powers. She's still deep in that identity maintenance, and even though there is this massive thing kind of pointing her to have to reconsider all of this, this gives her an out. It becomes a blip in her identity maintenance, a sigh of relief where she can say, actually no, I'm fine, I've maintained that myself, I got out of that. She may discover her spiritual side in her lowest moment, but this isn't a fundamental challenge to who she should be. If anything, it only reinforces it. It makes her cling to that identity even harder because she knows how close she got to losing it. Never again, she swears. If you've ever almost lost everything you define yourself by, a person, a context, a job, an opportunity, but then you get it back, you'll know what that moment of despair feels like. The moment of real reflection doesn't really come for Korra until the end of Season 2, when she faces down against Unalaq. Rather, the Avatar spirit is torn from her, spirit and body, her link to the past avatars severed, destroyed in front of her eyes. This role strain is almost worse than losing her bending here. She doesn't just feel like she's failed in her role, but she's failed every avatar before her, the whole world in the past, present, and future, and there is no real coming back from her for this. There is no cure to bring back the past avatars like there was with her bending. This is a permanent loss. Those self-schemas almost collapse for her, but Tenzin helps her finally re-examine this identity that she has clung to for so long.
Let go of your attachment to who you think you are and connect with your inner spirit. Rava is not who you are. You have always been strong, unyielding, and fearless. Before he fused with Rava, Wan was just a regular person. He wasn't defined by Rava any more than you are. Don't bend the elements, but the energy within yourself.
A lot of therapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, is about re-examining and deconstructing the automatic critical self-assumptions we have about ourselves and the world, the things we may not even be totally aware that we are saying and thinking to ourselves that affect how we think and approach life, and then getting us to question their validity, getting right down to the foundation of those self-schemas in our identity maintenance, and asking, is this true? Here, Tenzin is getting her to ask, is she still the Avatar? Does being the Avatar really just mean being the most powerful bender in the room? Is she still worth anything? Is her worth dependent on how powerful she is, what she can do for other people and the world? Is real power all to do with bending, or is it something more? Is she just a competent bender, or is she also someone who fights for justice? Is what really happened to her in her control? What is the most important thing she can provide to this world? This moment from Tenzin is all about role renegotiation, but it is only the beginning of that process. Something needs to give way for Korra here, either to despair or to finding some new sense of hope. Here, it's about looking at one fundamental schema. I am powerful and I am valuable because I am the Avatar, and that becomes, I am powerful and I am valuable because I stand up for what's right. The Tree of Time itself here is a place built for her to relive and re-engage with her own memories, with this narrative that she's built for herself, with that identity. She sees her past and her memories up against the wall, and so she meditates, she reflects, she takes the time to question these things, to understand how these things affect how she views herself and the world, and then she emerges stronger for it. This moment is about Korra understanding herself outside the context of being the Avatar, outside the gifts and the destiny she was born into, but also developing a sense of identity which is not tied to external measures of validation. She can still be fierce and stand for justice when nobody else sees her doing it. When Korra asks Tenzin if he believes she can do this without the Avatar spirit, he tells her he has no doubt. Something she has probably needed to hear her whole life, but not truly internalized until now. When people might have said things like this to her in the past, she would have filtered it through the lens of the role that she can provide for others as the Avatar. Here, she doesn't necessarily change her personal identity, her values, her goals, her beliefs, those are still her, but she does develop, I think, a new relational identity and public identity in a sense. She's not just the Avatar in relation to the world, she's Korra, and that has value too. Too often, we define ourselves by what we can do for others, and we forget who we are outside of that. She is someone who stands up and fights when the moment counts, and this is, ultimately, the only real power humans have. And yet at the same time, I still think she retains that rigidly internal locus of control, believing everything does depend on her actions, and she remains responsible, even if she still develops a different relationship with power. Like all therapy, Her struggles are not something she answers once, fully internalizes, and then magically is cured of everything else and moves on, psychologically speaking. This is only one piece of the puzzle and the beginning of a very long journey. Therapy is layered. It is something we slowly unpack over time and that often we never fully get to the depths of. All of these issues are compounded in this season by the Water Tribe Civil War, where, like the Equalists, it's a morally complicated conflict that she just doesn't feel prepared for. And that in a sense, she's told there isn't really a role for her to step into here. And like with Tarlok, Korra makes the wrong decision again, thinking she's picking the side of the spirits, which is what the Avatar is meant to do, right? That gifted kid meeting the reality of the world rears its head again. Her power, from which she's always derived a sense of self-worth, feels more and more irrelevant by the day, and she isn't sure how to deal with that. She goes on with a semi-stable sense of identity by the end of this, cracked but not yet fractured, and so it doesn't really demand a full and deep reflection on everything and how she imagines herself. No, that happens with Zahir.
I'm not the Avatar anymore.
At the end of Season 3, Korra is captured by Zahir in the Red Lotus. She's chained up and poisoned with mercury, a metal which is forced into her bloodstream, the aim to draw her into the Avatar state and kill her, ending the Avatar cycle forever. While she manages to break free, the poison wears her body down, and she's only saved by others, with her body falling to the ground, broken beneath her. She ends up in a wheelchair, her bending greatly weakened, unable to enter the Avatar state, and virtually paralyzed. It is only here that Korra's real journey towards healing begins, physically and psychologically. But the road is long and hard. It's easy to view this moment with Zahir as merely a traumatic event where she was defeated, but there's something I think we often overlook. She wasn't just beaten or defeated, like when Zahir kidnapped her or when the dark spirit in the ocean thrashed her. She was tortured. She was violated in a bodily and psychological way that goes far beyond mere defeat. The poison being forced into her body is uniquely invasive. It still remains there even after she's defeated. Korra's greatest strength, the Avatar state, her own body, was used against her to render her more vulnerable, dependent, and weaker than she has ever felt before. And this unique kind of violation didn't just happen with the Red Lotus. This happened with Unalaq tearing Rava from her body too, reaching into her and ripping this integral, personal part of her out and onto the ground, and killing it. These cross a boundary which is especially traumatizing and invasive and violates her bodily autonomy. Torture appears to disrupt the body's natural pre-reflective harmony, forcing individuals into a heightened and agonizing awareness of their physical state. This shift in bodily awareness suggests that overwhelming pain does not merely cause suffering, but also fundamentally alters the victim's relationship with their body and self. The participants' account indicate that their conscious attempts to suppress or detach from their body sensations can be interpreted as a strategy to reclaim control in an otherwise powerless environment. Like many torture and trauma survivors, Korra experiences disconnection from her body, which she feels has betrayed her. Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe in their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior comfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and, in an attempt to control these processes, they become expert at ignoring their gut feelings, and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside, they learn to hide from themselves. Korra's body was changed from her source of power and pride into something vulnerable and controllable by someone else. She doesn't feel safe inside it anymore. She can't even cook or dress for herself. Her body was powerful, it was the Avatar, but others have violated her so many times that she doesn't even feel like it belongs to her anymore, and she cannot rely on it the way she used to. Unalaq literally tore a piece of her soul out of her. Zahir forced her body into its ultimate defense mechanism. This dissociation from her own body is perhaps the most fundamental challenge to that identity she had for herself yet. She originally refuses to go see Katara at all for healing, instead trusting her body to recover on its own because, it would, and it's fine, and she's not that sort of person. But when it doesn't, it only deepens that bodily dissociation. In a sense, Zahir and the torture did take something from her body she can't just take back. Unable to heal, that role strain, that gap between her expectations of who she should be and who she can be, becomes an abyss she cannot deal with. Shame becomes a dominant psychological theme in Korra's arc here. It's the feeling of being fundamentally flawed or inadequate, where before, when she lost her bending or lost Rava, it was what was called state shame, a temporary and situational feeling which eventually goes away and we move on from. When Korra is poisoned, it becomes trait shame. This is chronic and self-defining. This is new. It is a shame which becomes part of your identity. Not that she has failed, but she is a failure. We spoke about self-schemas before, and here one becomes, I am a failed avatar. Everything which happened to her feels like proof she is fundamentally broken. The greater the gap between her identity and how she understands herself, the deeper the shame embeds itself as a lens through which she views her worth. It tells her she is no longer worthy of the legacy she inherited. The world's disappointment is justified because she is insufficient. Losing one's role unravels the framework through which we understand ourselves and the world. The basic assumptions about who we are and what our future holds must be reconstructed to make room for this new reality. It can be a painful and disorienting process. When Korra began with a strong sense of self-efficacy, she develops a lower self-efficacy with each defeat. And where her locus of control began as rigidly internal, here you could say that it shifts to unhealthily external, where she feels progressively more and more that things in her life and the world are beyond her control, that she cannot change things. And yet, this is complicated by that feeling of guilt and shame, and it also simultaneously somehow being her responsibility anyway. She didn't just lose her power, her status, her body, but also her purpose. This is all made worse by the creeping realization that the world no longer seems to want or need her. The Equalists, the Water Tribe Civil War, now she's expected to stand back while Kuvira makes radical decisions about the balance of the world, which once would have been the jurisdiction of the Avatar. The Airbenders are doing her work for her, as Tenzin and the rest seem to go out of their way to assure her that actually they're totally fine and they don't need her and she just needs to worry about herself. But that's not what she wants to hear. In a sense, the worst part is, it looks like it's working. 3 years pass while she tries to recover, and the world hasn't fallen apart. If anything, it's gotten better after Ba Sing Se fell to anarchy, another thing she didn't manage to stop. Confirmation that her role, and thus she, is unnecessary. This isn't so much role confusion as it is role erasure. She feels like she was raised for a world which left her behind, obsolete. And even with that, she is incompetent. The strategies she developed after losing the Avatar spirit last time don't work. Tenzin's words feel hollow, especially because this time she can't just get up and fight again. Everything is gone.
The mind can be a powerful ally, or your greatest enemy.
Struggling, Korra falls back on isolation as a coping mechanism once more. She lies to her parents and flees into the wilderness again, into the back alleys and forgotten villages of the Earth Kingdom, places where nobody even knows who she is. She distances herself from her friends in Republic City, leaving Marco and Bolin's letters unanswered. She only sends a letter to Asami. In Korra's case, isolation has a dual function. It shields her from the pressures of human interaction, hating the pity she feels people look at her with, because with so much of her self-worth being dependent on others relying on her and viewing her as a beacon of strength and justice, this is awful. But isolation also softens that trait shame that she struggles with, because out there, in the wilderness, where nobody knows who she is, at least there isn't the context which makes that shame relevant. In this sense, isolation also gives her a sense of independence she feels deprived of. Even being beaten within an inch of her life in cage fights, that's still a kind of independence and control she couldn't find while around others. Keeping extraordinarily violatory problems, which maybe they never recover from, like torture, a secret, is also often a defense mechanism to shield loved ones from the emotional burdens of their past. But this too is a kind of isolation. Victims of torture often struggle with the sense that others are harmed while trying to protect them, as well as shame over their inability to withstand it. This is something I think we see with Korra, with her body ultimately succumbing to the poison sooner than it should have before she could take Zahir down on her own. That shame mixed with a feeling of weakness. The psychological and enduring complexity of these issues often leads people to a lack of trust in doctors and institutions, which is also something Korra clearly struggles with. She doesn't trust them to fix her, she refuses multiple times the help of medical professionals, and cannot bear the shame of getting them to help. I can only imagine that she never fully opened up about the extent of her ordeals and how it's truly impacted her. This is definitely implied in the letters from her friends, who really don't seem to have a good idea of what's going through her head. Torture interferes with our brain's working memory, with high-level thinking and self-reflection, our ability to imagine the future. Instead, it gets us stuck in the persistent present from which we struggle to rise. There is a loneliness, I think, to positions of responsibility and authority like Korra has, wherein sharing struggles or showing pain can itself feel like a failing in your duties. You are meant to shoulder everything. You are meant to lead the way forward. Her friends and Tenzin cannot fully get it, never will, never went through what she did, and don't occupy the same role and responsibility she does. Even though she sends that one letter to Asami, she eventually isolates herself from Asami too. Isolation becomes the last retreat of someone who thinks they should carry the world on their shoulders, because at least then they're carrying themselves. But on the other hand, Korra's isolation also allows her to be free of being the Avatar. Yeah, she lets go of the goals and values and beliefs and sense of identity she defined herself by and doesn't know where to go, but she's also free of the immediate burdens of that role. Isolation allows her to become someone else. The problem then is, who? There's a moment where Korra cuts her hair short and discards her waterbending armband, symbols of that previous life she lived and representing this new version of herself. It's actually relatively common for people to make radical changes to how they look in the aftermath of a traumatic experience, especially as they feel disconnected from who they were before and even their physical body, which they're now trying to change and reshape. But the trouble comes in then not having a healthy identity to fall back on. It is instead just reducing ourselves down a lot of the time. Trauma can profoundly affect our sense of self, leaving a lasting imprint both on the cognitive and the somatic domains of the individual's sense of self. Cognitively, individuals who have experienced trauma are often tormented by thoughts that reflect intensely negative core beliefs about themselves. After extended periods of time, it can make us feel like our trauma and our wounds are part of our identity, even more of our identity, that they swallow up everything else we were or could be, instead of it just being something which happened to us. On some level, Korra knows she has value beyond her role as the Avatar, beyond her bending abilities. She knows she is more than that. But too often, knowing something is true is not the same as feeling it. And recovery is often about trying to bring our feelings in line with what we might intellectually know as the reality. In this, Korra also turns to self-destructive behaviors to cope. If it's towards emotional regulation during trauma, can include high-risk or self-injurious behaviors because self-harm affords the individual a sense of being in control. The affect regulation and anti-suicide models both describe self-harm similarly as a way of mastering feelings through the elimination of those feelings. This is especially as a way to reclaim control of her body, which she feels so disconnected from. At first, it manifests in things like Korra barely sleeping, barely eating. This is a kind of self-punishment, but also something she can control in a time where little else about her body seems to be under her control. The inconsistency of traumatic recovery can create a feeling of stagnation, and in that, loss of control, a sense that nothing is going to get better, and so, people often turn to more and more extreme solutions. For Korra, that is namely cage fighting. Brutal, fast-paced fights which leave her with wounds and bruises, things which at least those will heal. Pain is at least a connection with the body, with reality. This is pain she chooses. In one scene, she is literally fighting against a shadowy version of herself, bound in chains, glaring with the Avatar state, her past and her body being something separate from her. The cage fights, and her fights with the shadow figure from then on, bear remarkable similarities to her fight with Zahir. In her mind, it's him that she comes up against. He takes on the form of those she's fighting, and she imagines herself bound up in chains at the wrists and ankles again, almost as if to reenact her trauma. Re-experiencing can occur through reenactments, literally to redo, by which trauma survivors repeatedly relive and recreate the past trauma in their present lives. Sometimes individuals reenact past traumas to master them. The subtext here is that if medication and hospitalization and water healing did not help her, then maybe by winning these fights, she can finally defeat her trauma and master her body once and for all, take control of herself again and her body. That it's simply a problem of willpower and skill, because nothing else seems to be working. Especially because she's told that if she just works hard and dedicates herself, then things will get better, so when they don't, it becomes another failure on her part. But of course, the thing I really appreciate about Korra's journey here is how it recognizes trauma is much more complicated than that.
Being the Avatar can wait.
Traumatic symptoms are a complex mix of factors: genetics, biology, personal history, resilience. What is traumatic for one person isn't always for another, and sometimes past events can become more traumatic in the light of new events. Korra faced a lifetime of pretty high-stakes losses, but her fight with Zahir shook her sense of self in a way which recontextualized a lot of those losses in the past, like losing her bending initially, losing Rava in the past lives. As she grapples with shame and failure and feelings of weakness, these moments crystallize in her mind in a new cognitive and somatic domain for her sense of self, a new narrative of failure. Her ego integrity falls apart, with these no longer being things she can healthily remember. Korra suffers from flashbacks. In psychological terms, these are involuntary, sensory-driven re-experiences of trauma that often come with the same fear and physiological response as the original event. Trauma can hijack the brain in this way, making the body and mind react as if the threat is happening all over again. These come in the form of nightmares for her, but they also manifest in moments of high stress and conflict, anything which remotely resembles her fight with Zahir. Korra's flashbacks return to her in those moments. Amon taking her bending, Unalaq severing her connection to Rava, Zahir forcing his poison into her in the Avatar state. As Toph puts it,
"Sounds like you're carrying around your former enemies, the same way you're still carrying around that metal poison."
But there is another lens here that I think would help us understand Korra's trauma specifically, because it can perhaps best be understood as similar to those who have been traumatized by combat specifically. While studies of torture and bodily violation yield many similarities, military veterans, like Korra, have identities built around duty and sacrifice and high-stakes decision-making of success and failure. These identities can sometimes be completely destabilized when the structure of the military or wartime is removed. Forced back into a more ordinary life, these violent moments take on new emotional baggage. Up to 32% of veteran populations experience symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks, hyperarousal, that sort of thing. Like Korra, their bodies are engaged in battle long after it ends, and they struggle to develop a new relationship with violence, with what they have done and the violence done to them. Sometimes flashbacks can take the form of hallucinations. Korra's hallucinations externalize the internal struggle of her trauma. The part of her that once felt invincible is no longer a source of strength, but a threat. She's haunted by a vision of herself bound in chains. It is a literal confrontation with the self she can no longer be, and simultaneously her moment of greatest strength and weakness. The self which was supposed to be strong, but was actually the most vulnerable she had ever been. CPSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is defined as a chain of traumatic events rather than a single instant, a nexus of complex traumatic events all interacting and filtering through each other. Korra does have a chain of events, though perhaps not as strongly as someone like Zuko, let's say. CPTSD requires two negative alterations in cognition and mood. These include the inability to recall key features of the trauma, overly negative thoughts about oneself or the world, exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma, negative affect, decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated or difficulty being happy. The only one of these Korra does not seem to fit is an inability to recall key features of the trauma. Though, I actually think we don't know that from what we see in the series. It's very hard to kind of get inside Korra's head and exactly know how she remembers the event. The rest are increasingly evident as she isolates herself. It also requires intrusion symptoms, such as hallucinations, nightmares, flashbacks, as well as deregulated emotional distress and physical reactivity, all symptoms which Korra definitely exhibits. Avoidance is a third factor, as well as reenacting the trauma, self-destructive behaviors. Again, she fits this. The last determinant is functional significance. This has to have an impact on the person's ability to function in everyday life. We see that it regularly impacts her ability to sleep, to carry out basic activities, to even do the smallest things she once did, to take care of herself, to maintain relationships, to regulate herself emotionally. The isolation is emblematic of all of this. All of these things together paint a very complex psychology for Korra. Long after a traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize distributed brain circuits in secret and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. Feeling out of control, survivors often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption. What I really appreciate about Korra's recovery as a story, as a narrative to do with mental health, is how non-linear and realistic it is.
Korra gets a lot of criticism as a character for needing to learn the same lesson multiple times, but honestly, I kind of love that. That's what recovery is like a lot of the time. It is repetitive and it feels like hitting your head against a wall. That's what breaking down these assumptions we have about ourselves and the world often takes. We do have to learn those lessons multiple times as we get reminded why we had to learn them before. We have to walk away. And sometimes it's hard not to look back.
Trauma leaves a lasting mark on her body and mind. There is no quick fix, which sets her apart from so many fictional portrayals where a character bounces back after a single heartfelt moment or a training montage or a, true love's first kiss. She doesn't just get over it. First, she tries recovery through physiotherapy and water healing, thinking that if she just regains her physical strength and her bending, she can reclaim her former self. Then she tries meditating. She tries getting fresh air and sailing. She tries reconnecting with the spirit world. None of these give her the fix she so desires. The real damage runs deeper. The inconsistency of recovery often involves moments where we feel like we finally get it. We feel like we're on the crest of something. We feel like we've finally come to terms with it, only to then fall back into old habits. Korra's recovery is ups and downs. It is psychologically her feeling more okay with it in one moment and then really struggling the next, mustering the strength to continue on and then giving up. And even though her body might get progressively better over time, her mind certainly goes through a different journey. She turns to cage fighting to force her body into obedience until she learns that actually the poison is still lingering inside her. A simple solution, she thinks. Get the poison out and she'll be cured, she thinks. That's what's destroying her. But even after she gets the poison out, she's not okay. She's optimistic, but her body just isn't quite there. So, finally, she returns to Zahir, the source of her trauma, right? To confront him directly, to see him confined in chains that he cannot hurt her, that he is not the monster in her mind.
I came here to look you in the eye and tell you that you have no power over me. I will no longer be scared of you.
But this too doesn't completely work. Korra, like many, thinks of her mind and body as separate, that the body is simply a vehicle for the mind, and it's just an issue of willpower and determination. If she can just push her body hard enough, then it will eventually follow. Or that the mind is simply helping the body to do its work, and she just has to get over this, and then her body will be fine. Korra buys into both of these mistaken ideas in different ways. She thinks that confronting Zahir will mean regaining perfect control of the avatar state and entering the spirit world, but it's not as easy as that. Her recovery requires her to evolve her relationship with her own body and mind. Exposure therapy is a common trauma treatment that means confronting and reframing the traumatic experiences in some way or another. The rationale for exposure therapy is that by continuing to expose oneself to a safe, yet frightening stimulus, anxiety diminishes, leading to a decrease in escape and avoidance behavior that was maintained via negative reinforcement. This kind of confrontation can help certain people with their anxieties, their depression, their psychological hurdles, the things which are tied to fears of a particular thing or moment or person. Here, Korra gets to safely relive that moment with Zahir, and hopefully her body can start to learn that that gnawing discomfort of her past isn't necessary anymore. She thinks that confronting Zahir in prison will prove that he's not a threat to herself, inside her mind, get at the ghost she's got at the back of her head, that he's just a man in chains, that she's in control now. Her visit to Toph and the banyan tree do much the same thing. This is about symptom mastery and affect tolerance, helping her to develop new coping mechanisms such that traumatic triggers no longer overwhelm her defense mechanisms. And over time, it starts to work. She begins to manage her flashbacks and hallucinations better. She regains control of her body and her mind. It's about learning to healthily reconnect with her own identity. Many trauma survivors are able to mobilize strengths in one domain to cope with vulnerabilities and recovery in another, and I think we see that here in the scene with Zahir. Korra feels more sure in her body than she did in the past. She's gotten back some of her powers, her stature, she can actually do stuff with it, she's healed a bit, and so a physical confrontation with Zahir allows her to maybe feel stronger mentally than she otherwise might be on her own. Korra has to reframe her thinking on multiple levels. She has to become more aware of that inner experience, to question those base assumptions she has about herself even more than she did back when she lost Rava. She has to allow herself to heal slowly. Korra attempted to face her trauma with the same steadfast strategy she has for almost everything else, head on and directly, as something which can be beaten, something she can wrestle with. But her story is one of learning to not outrun or overpower, but allowing herself to be fully present with what happened to her, to live alongside it instead of trying to dominate it, to let go of that incessant need to wrestle with things. That itself is growth.
When we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change.
Post-traumatic growth is the process of positive psychological changes that can sometimes come from grappling with deeply painful experiences. It doesn't erase the suffering, and it doesn't mean that the trauma was worth it in the end, which is a narrative we often see popping up in fiction, but also in real life, and that can be a pretty damaging way to think about it. But in some cases, the process of surviving and making sense of pain can lead to new perspectives. Psychologists identify 5 areas where this growth is most often seen. It's in an appreciation for life, improved relationships, a sense of new possibilities, personal strength, and spiritual change. Interestingly, spiritual change is really the first area we see Korra grow and embrace this. She connects with the Banyan Grove with Toph's help, then Zahir guides her into the spirit world where she reconnects with Rava, and in the end, it's her spirit bending that saves Kuvira. She so often focuses on her bending abilities, raw power, her physical capacity, but it's only in allowing herself to reconnect with her spiritual side that she really heals. It's in her strength separate from her as the Avatar, in her empathy, her wisdom, her sense of justice. It's that which allows her to save the world this final time. That is the culmination of her healing arc. Her fight with Unalaq sees her come to a similar realization, but here she has to reach it again and take it to even new heights, to really get down to the foundations and rebuild from nothing. This growth enables Korra to change in other ways as well. She develops a new appreciation for life and the complexity peace requires. Instead of just trying to establish it through force, she finds new self-worth, she leaves isolation and reaches out to friends and mentors, most meaningfully with Asami. But perhaps most importantly, she finally enters that real period of role renegotiation, personal, collective, public, and relational. She is more than just her powers, more than just the Avatar. She rebuilds her self-efficacy around her moral and persevering fortitude and moves towards a more flexible locus of control, understanding where things are the result of her actions and where things are beyond her control. She relinquishes those feelings of shame and guilt and self-blame built on damaging self-schemas and a poor sense of ego integrity, and she adopts new, realistic views of herself as someone deserving of self-care and fulfillment. Meaning-making is when the survivor learns to assign new meaning to their trauma and to themselves within that, to the world in which such a traumatic event can take place. Again, this isn't saying that the trauma is worth it, but it is allowing them to approach it differently. For some, this manifests in newfound strength and compassion for others. In others, it can become a new creative pursuit, determined social action, or embracing a survivor mission. I think it matters that Korra's final act in the series is recognizing the wounded, scared parts of Kuvira that she felt in herself. Someone who felt powerless and so clung to power however they could, and defined herself by it. In a sense, Korra does all of these things in some way. This is the mission of the Avatar, and she has to reimagine it and reapproach it. Korra is knocked down again and again and again. She is stripped of every external marker she once used to define herself by: her bending, her connection to the past lives, her role as the Avatar. She spent her entire life believing she had to be this one thing, because it was the greatest thing, the only thing that mattered in the end, and more important than any one person's individual hopes and dreams, more important than anything she could want. But she got back up, once, twice, again and again, and every time it hurts more, every time it's harder, but every time she still did it. Her healing is messy. It doesn't mean becoming who you were before your trauma. It means coming to terms with who you are now. That's what survival is. It's finding the strength to keep going when you feel that shame, when you've lost your purpose, when you've lost everything, to find something new. It's about choosing to be brave when we're most afraid, because that is the only time we can be brave. Just as our darkest moments are the only times we can be strong. You are not weak when you falter. You're just a human who maybe needs a hand up, so that when you stand again, you can turn around and help someone else up.
You will find that if you look for the light, you can often find it. But if you look for the dark, that is all you will ever see.
Mental illness has always occupied a weird place in fiction. Sometimes madness is a connection to powers and Lovecraftian gods beyond our comprehension. Sometimes split personality disorders are a superpower. Sometimes depression is the gateway to artistic genius. It's something I've been thinking about a lot over the years, how we can meaningfully and empathetically portray that struggle, often through the lens of magic, in these fantastical stories. Legend of Korra itself does blend magic and mental illness in its own way, and I wanted to delve into that a bit more deeply than I could here, so I did. I've made a special episode where I talk a bit more through Korra and Cosmic Horror and Jekyll and Hyde and even the Stormlight Archives, What Remains of Edith Finch, to kind of explore how we keep using magic and metaphor to capture mental illness, and how we've done it badly, and what we've learned over the years, and where a lot of that comes from. And that special episode is available on Nebula right now, and what's even better is that it's not my only special episode over there. I've got a couple. I've got one on the ending to Game of Thrones and whether or not the books are gonna turn out like that. I've got one on Andor and authoritarianism, and guess what? You actually don't even have to pay to listen to them anymore, because Nebula now does free trials. They're available at my link down below, or the QR code you can see now on screen. You can just scan it with your phone, and it is important to use my link. And even better, for December you can get 50% off the annual subscription if you're interested. And every account now comes with guest passes, which is this thing we wanted to test, which allows people to share Nebula or videos with their friends, and it's been a mind-blowing success. Nebula, if you didn't know, is a streaming service made for and by creators. In fact, I am one of the owners. A view on Nebula is worth, 100 times what it is on YouTube. And my stuff isn't the only stuff you can watch there. We have exclusive series like A Bit Obscure, which explores strange places like the buried laboratory outside Chicago where America's first nuclear reactors were buried, part of the Manhattan Project. Or there's Lindsay Ellis's new video on bluey adults. There are short films and game shows. It is its own thing. Not to mention, you can get all of my videos early there. I took the sponsor because YouTube can be a bit finicky about videos which discuss suicide or self-harm or so on, but also because I am fortunate enough to be a co-owner of Nebula. The online landscape is rapidly evolving, and this is where I think great content is moving towards. Point being, go listen to my episode on magical mental illness, check it out for yourself, see if you like Nebula like hundreds of thousands of others already do. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.